Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share some terrifying cryptid encounters I found on the internet. In each story, the person encountering the creatures aren't quite sure what they saw, so let's see if we can figure it out for them. These stories include a girl who had something chase her up her driveway, a young man and his friends who had something growl at them on a golf course one night, and a young woman who saw something strange in the Australian bush. But first, we start with a story from a homeless man who saw a bizarre creature in the Arizona desert. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw something terrifying, so he pulled out his sword and waved it at the creature, chasing it off. Stick with me now, as this story isn't as far-fetched as it may seem. The original poster, or OP, was homeless at the time and in Sierra Vista, Arizona, which is about 15 minutes from the Mexican border by his estimation. The OP says he had been homeless for about 6 months at this point and maintained the routine of staying up all night to remain moving, which kept him warm. When the sun came up, the warm rays made it much easier to fall asleep. He would sleep a few hours before getting lunch at a local charity, take a nap at dinner, then wake up when the sun was setting and wander through the desert to remain warm until sunrise. He lays out a schedule so anyone reading his story will know he was normally awake at that time, meaning he was wide awake during his encounter, so no one would question if it was a dream, his imagination, or anything else like that. During the day as he moved about the town, he remained unarmed, but he had stashed a straight-edged sword in his burrow he had bought back when he had a job and a home. He carried the sword, which was sheathed on his back at night due to him being so far out in the desert that he couldn't see the lights from the town. He had only ever used it to carve up yucca stalks to make the roof of his burrow until that one fateful evening. The OP had been out walking about an hour and was about 5 miles or so from town and the nearest person. He was walking along a small wash twirling a stick he had picked up when he heard the thump of something walking ahead of him within some scruffy bushes, obscuring his view of whatever it was. He didn't want to approach this thing in the event that it was something dangerous, so he smacked the nearest tree with his stick. The thumping footsteps stopped and a head poked out from behind the bush. He describes the head as having big eyes with sparse tufts of hair and looking primate-like, but almost reptilian. His first instinct was to grab his sword's handle and pull it from its sheath on its back, but it didn't quite play out like you'd see in the movies. When he yanked his sword, the strap broke and it came with the sword over his shoulder. He began brandishing it in front of him, sword still in its sheath, at the weird-looking lizard monkey creature. As he is doing so, the creature rose to its full height, which the OP estimates to be about 4 feet tall, and took off running at an alarming speed. He says it looked kind of like an ostrich the way it ran, looking more awkward than scary in its retreat. The OP says he went back to his burrow before reminiscing about the fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and corn the Salvation Army had the next day. In a comment to this story, one user asked the OP if the following description of a lizard man of the desert sounded familiar. The description is from the website OurStrangePlanet.com and reads as follows. He is maybe about 6 foot tall, very, very skinny, and it had an awkward gait, like a monkey, or a man with a disease, almost robotic. The OP responded to the comment saying that sounded very familiar to what he saw that night. He goes on to say the lighting wasn't good and he didn't get a good look at the creature, but says it was definitely a juvenile judging by the size of it. He says the only difference in what the person described on the website was that this thing had tufts of hair on top and on the side of its head. The hair, if it could be called that, was very short, scraggly, and probably too thin to even be called hair, according to the OP. I have heard of the cryptid known as Lizard Man and other reptilian beings as well, but unfortunately stories about them are hard to come by, so I was happy to have stumbled upon this one and knew I had to include it in an episode. Given the description the OP gives of the thing he saw in the desert and the description from the website backing him up that he agrees sounded just like what he saw, this certainly seems to be a humanoid reptilian cryptid. It's a good thing he had a sword with him, even if it was still in its sheath when he brandished it in front of him, but it was seemingly enough to scare this creature into running away. I will say I never thought I'd be featuring a story on this channel where a swordsman fended off a reptilian beast. Seems more like a medieval type of encounter. But when you cover enough of these stories, you begin to expect anything and everything. What do you think the OP saw out in the Arizona desert that night? A lizard man, reptilian cryptid, or something else? The next story comes from northern Wisconsin, where the original poster encountered a humanoid creature in the woods outside her childhood home. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that she lived in a rural area and her home was at the end of a dirt road. She also mentions that she was never afraid of the woods behind her home until that day, spending most of her childhood out there exploring. She was 14 years old when her encounter took place. Unfortunately for the OP, her parents didn't have a good marriage, which resulted in them fighting a lot. This led to her spending most of her time outside, where she says she felt more at home. When it was warm enough at night, she would take her sleeping bag and sleep on the roof of an old shack that was on her family's property. She would see bears and wolves, but was not afraid of either animal. She did not believe in the paranormal or any kind of cryptid and only got lost in the woods once when it got darker sooner than she expected. The summer she turned 14, she was home alone and had ventured down her home's long driveway to check the mail. Following behind her was her cat, who followed her everywhere, and the OP had even come to rely on him to let her know when a bear was nearby. The OP made it to the mailbox, but soon heard movement behind her and knew something was in the trees across the road. She assumed it was a deer because they were everywhere in the area she lived, but then a loud crash caught her attention and she knew something very big was moving through the brush. She describes her next actions being like those of the characters in every classic horror movie, with no thought that what she was hearing might be something she didn't want to encounter. So she tucked the mail under her arm and ventured toward where she heard the sounds, her cat close in tow. She made it no more than 10 yards into the trees when she noticed there was no noise whatsoever. Everything on that beautiful June day was completely still. No birds singing, no insects, no leaves rustling. There was absolutely no sound. Almost simultaneously to her noticing there was no sound, that eerie feeling of being watched came over her. She stopped and scanned the trees for deer, and that's when she spotted two brown furry legs partially concealed by the branches. She relaxed, but then her cat started hissing. When she looked down at him, she noticed he had his back arched while hissing and looking at the same thing she was. She looked back at the legs just in time to see them move, but they didn't move like that of a deer. Instead, they moved like a human's would when walking. She wasted no time springing into action, dropping the mail and picking up her cat by the scruff before running. And to her horror, whatever was in the brush started running after her. She says she has never run that fast in her entire life. She sprinted up the driveway into her house and locked the door. She grabbed the phone and called her neighbor, who was an ex-police chief, and he came over immediately with his pistol. He went out to the spot and searched but found nothing. The OP was hysterical at this point, so her neighbor stayed with her until her mother came to pick her up. Both her mother and the neighbor thought she was completely delusional, but the OP says she knows what she saw, and the terror she felt. It was broad daylight out, so there was no mistaking the legs. She ends her post by saying she never felt safe in those woods again and stopped sleeping outside. In a couple of edits to her original post, she shares further information about the creature's legs and some of the details in her story. She starts by saying she thought she was looking at the front legs of a deer, and only when they took a step did she realize they were much too thick and human-like, only with fur, to be that of a deer. She also noticed then that there were only 2 legs and not 4. She also says she realized for it to be concealed by the tree branches, it had to be way too tall to be a deer. Everything from her seeing the legs to realizing these two things happened in a matter of seconds. In her second edit, she says she was a calm, rational child and her parents always knew when she slept outside. Her parents, and her siblings sometimes slept outside as a family to watch meteor showers. On the off chance she actually did encounter a wild animal, her father would always ask if she made a lot of noise, then told her good when she said she did. Usually, when you make a lot of noise in the woods when near wild animals, it deters them from wanting to interact with you and normally scares them off. That's what is taught anyway. She also notes that she had her neighbor's phone number for emergencies, and this was the only time she had called him. She says she felt like a fool when her mother, neighbor, and later her father looked at her like they didn't believe her. She adds that never once had her internal alarms gone off in those woods before her encounter. She ends by saying she knew absolutely without a doubt when she was looking at this thing that she was prey and she ran for her life. I couldn't imagine the terror this poor girl felt when she saw those two legs, which she initially thought was a deer, start walking like they belonged to something accustomed to walking on two legs. And then to be chased up her driveway? It's said that some of these creatures will give chase if you run and that you shouldn't run from them. But try telling that to a terrified 14-year-old girl. Actually, I can't say I wouldn't run either should I encounter something that made me feel like I was its prey, like she said she did. I don't blame her one bit for grabbing her cat and getting out of there. I'm just glad she made it safely back to her house. I've often said it's such a shame when these creatures rob us of something we love, such as hunting, hiking and camping, or just being outdoors in the woods or otherwise. And this is exactly what happened here. The OP really seemed to enjoy exploring the woods around her home. It was her escape, and this thing robbed her of that. Again, I can't say that I blame her for not wanting to go back out there. I probably wouldn't either. But without a more detailed description, I can't say for sure that's what it was. But for two fur-covered legs to start walking in a human-like way points to Sasquatch for me. But given that her story takes place in northern Wisconsin and there have been a lot of dogman stories in that state and the neighboring states, I can't completely rule out the possibility of that either. Also, she says she thought the legs belonged to a deer, and this makes me think the creature had hooves, which could point to this thing being a goat man. They are often said to have hooves. However, she doesn't mention the feet, but given she thought it was a deer, it makes me think it could have had hooves. What do you think this was? And would you have run from this thing too? The next story comes from a poster who was chased off a golf course late one night. The original poster does not say where exactly he lives, just that he is in New York, approximately 30 minutes from New York City. There are coyotes, foxes, raccoons, skunks, and on rare occasions black bear in the area where he lives. There was a spot on a golf course in the town he lives in where he and his friend group would go to drink and smoke. The spot was surrounded by a thick, lush forest. The night of his encounter, the OP arrived with his friends to their normal hangout spot. As they walked down a cart path to reach the spot, they heard a horrifying, deep, distorted growl come from beyond the tree line near where they were walking. The growl was followed by the snapping of saplings being broken in half. The group froze and started asking each other, "Did you hear that? And what was that?" before deciding to get out of there. The OP says that as he and his friend speedwalked back down the cart path, he felt like he was being watched the entire way and kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see a huge creature chasing them. When they reached the car, they got out of there in a hurry. They never saw anything, but whatever growled at them that night shook them to their very core. The OP then goes on to say that the growl did not sound like any of the previously mentioned animals that can normally be found in the area. He immediately dismisses the possibility it could have been a coyote because they have a high-pitched yelp and howl. He has heard them his entire life and knows it wasn't a coyote. He also knows it couldn't have been a fox or a raccoon, even though their cries can sound creepy. He says it could have been a bear due to the deepness of the growl and the breaking of the trees, but they are incredibly rare in the area. Plus, the growl did not sound exactly like a bear, or any other real animal for that matter, according to the OP. He goes on to say that it sounded like a wolf growl that someone used audio software to make the pitch rise then fall to an impossibly deep tone, distorting it to make it sound garbled and strange to the point it sounded almost digital. He ends his post by saying he wants it to just be a bear before adding in an edit that everyone who was there that night has had some sort of creepy, unexplainable experience out there on multiple occasions, and that there is something strange happening on that golf course at night. When I first read this post, I was thinking Sasquatch until he said it sounded like a wolf's growl. The growl and breaking of trees fits with a Sasquatch, but there have been a number of dogman sightings in New York. The thing that makes me think this was no normal animal is how distorted the OP says it sounded, and the fact he says it almost sounded like an audio clip. That makes me think it could have been a Wendigo. They are expert mimics, and their recreations of voices and sounds are said to sound distorted and like audio recordings. I believe him when he says there is something strange happening on that golf course, being that there have been multiple people having multiple weird experiences out there. I don't think I'd be going back out to that golf course at night and would find a new hangout spot. With the details from the story I mentioned, I definitely think this is some sort of cryptid. But the real mystery is which one? What do you think is lurking on that golf course? The final story of this episode comes to us from Australia, where a poster encounters something while out in the bush that terrified her and made her run for her life. Her encounter took place in the Blue Mountains, which is located in New South Wales, Australia. The range is considered part of the western outskirts of the Greater Sydney area. It covers a total area of 11,400 square kilometers, or 4,401 square miles, and reaches an elevation of 1,189 meters, or 3,901 feet. The original poster enjoys bushwalking, a hobby she picked up during childhood when she would go out with her father that she continues to this day. Sometimes when she ventures out for shorter walks, she will go alone. She says she knows this is dangerous and recognizes the additional dangers of being a woman out in the wilderness alone, but always carries knives with her, as well as a satellite phone. She loves and craves being out in the bush, completely surrounded by it. She posted her encounter 5 years after it happened. The OP decided she wanted to do an overnighter by herself in the bush, an idea she now recognizes as a bad one. Her walk started out normal and everything was going fine. She even passed 3 or 4 groups of people heading in the opposite direction she was. As dusk approached, she picked out a spot where she would spend the night and set up her one-person tent. She notes that she was about 30 meters from the trail. The spot she picked was behind some trees and other vegetation and mostly concealed. As she drifted to sleep, she listened to the normal wildlife sounds. However, there was another sound accompanying them that caught her attention. She describes it as a bounding sound and says it sounded like someone was sprinting through the bush right past where she was. But whatever it was ran by entirely too fast and covered too great a distance in too few many strides to be a person. She adds that once you leave the trail in the Australian bush, there is very little uncovered ground to walk normally on, much less run on at such high speeds. You have to wade through it according to the OP, so it was improbable that someone was out there running around through it like that. Hearing whatever was out there made her feel uneasy, but she dismissed the feeling. When she awoke the next morning, she ate, packed her things, and made her way back to the trail, where she began walking. She passed a few people before finding herself alone again for about half an hour. That's when she heard a stick snap off the trail to her left, breaking as if someone had stepped on it. She turned and scanned the area before seeing something that almost made her, in her words, die on her feet. There was a creature standing a good distance off the trail just staring at her. She tried telling herself it was a person, but knew deep down it couldn't be. She says she couldn't quite judge how tall this being was, but that she'd guess it was somewhere around 9 feet in height. Its skin was a dark gray or brownish color, and its head was horrifically large, she says, with 2 huge black eyes. She could not see this thing's mouth, but says its arms and legs were extraordinarily long. She froze, standing there looking at this creature with tears welling up in her eyes. She almost cried as she stood there, feeling like her legs were locked in their current position. A sense of dread came over her, and the longer she and the creature stared at each other, the more intense it became. She says she has never felt anything like it before. The fear continued building until she says she could see her heartbeat in her veins. That's when she knew it was time to get out of there, so she ran, sprinting down the trail away from this being. Tears were streaming down her face as she ran, too afraid to look back. She did not stop running until she caught up with another group that was going the same way she was. They took one look at her and immediately started asking if she was all right. She told them she had seen something and asked if she could walk with them the rest of the way, which they agreed to let her do. She ends her post by saying it took her 6 months to start going bushwalking again, but she never goes alone and you couldn't pay her to. At the very end of her post, she posted a short summary for those who found her story too long to read, saying she saw what was probably an alien in the Australian bush. She posted an edit after this saying she called it an alien because it didn't have any fur from what she could tell, and it was too lanky and thin to be a giant mammal or something similar. She says it looked like a human who had been stretched out, with an enlarged head and eyes, and that the proportions of the body looked too off to be a human, especially the length of the arms. When I first heard this story, I thought this could be a crawler. After reading it, I remembered doing some crawler stories from Australia where a girl was followed from home to home by such a creature, and I'm thinking this is what the OP in this story encountered as well. It would certainly seem that way based on the physical description of the being. The speed and swiftness with which she said this thing moved also points to this thing being a crawler. However, the height she mentions it standing at, being 9 feet tall, doesn't really fit with a crawler. They are usually said to be anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall. That's the only thing about this story that has me a bit puzzled. I mean, we know next to nothing about any cryptid except what we've heard in these encounter stories, so it could be possible for crawlers to be taller than that normal height range. Or perhaps the OP did see an actual alien in the Australian bush. What do you think she saw staring at her out there that day? Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to do something a little different in that I am going to share stories revolving around an area near the Joshua Tree National Park in Southern California. These stories were emailed to me by a viewer who has had strange things happen to him and his family in a desert canyon near the park. I'd like to thank Jay for sending in his story and allowing me to share it, along with some very interesting photos of what looks to be the creature that resides there. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. As I mentioned, these stories take place in Joshua Tree National Park. Located in southeastern California, east of San Bernardino and Los Angeles, Joshua Tree National Park covers a total area of 795,156 acres, which equates to 1,242 square miles or 3,217 square kilometers. The Mojave Desert and the Colorado Desert come together within the park, and the Little San Bernardino Mountains run along its southwest border. It consists of desert terrain. Jay has told me that there are a lot of unexplained encounters, disappearances, and deaths in Joshua Tree National Park, so it's no surprise to him that its neighboring deserts, canyons, and mountains also contain strange mysteries and encounters of their own. He sent me a series of emails not only detailing his family's exploration of a cave, which led to his nephew having a face-to-face encounter with a strange creature, but also something that he experienced himself while there. Also, there is a story a coworker told him about the area. Being that he took the time to write out his story and that his emails are so well written, I'm going to let him tell the story himself by reading the emails he sent to me. His first email detailing the encounter with the creature reads as follows. My family and I enjoy the outdoors. As I mentioned, we live in Southern California. We are surrounded by mountains, deserts, and canyons. We spend a lot of time camping and exploring the local canyons during our cooler months. We also enjoy going for short day getaways. Our usual spots are very isolated and lonely. We had a couple of favorite areas that we would always go to. We enjoy the remote and peaceful isolation. Keep this fact in mind. A few years ago, heavy rains caused major damage to the main paved road leading into the canyons, and subsequently we had to find a new area to camp. There are a few dirt roads that remained open, so we decided to find a new spot for the time being. We found the perfect area that met all our preferences. It was February of 2019 during a hike into the canyons while we were specifically looking for a trail that might lead to the top of a certain canyon. We happened across a medium-sized opening at the bottom of a canyon. The opening was oval-shaped and big enough for an adult to crawl in. It was 7 of us in total. It was myself with a few nephews, my niece, and her boyfriend. Our ages range from my age, mid-40s, to my youngest nephew that was around 12 years old. Since we had not planned on such exploration, we didn't have flashlights with us. Nonetheless, this did not deter us from exploring that opening. Curiosity got the best of us and we decided to crawl in and find out how deep that opening was. My 20-year-old nephew had a headlamp in his backpack, so he led the way. The rest of us used our cell phone lights to guide us. As we crawled in about 6 to 8 feet, the opening led us into a narrow cave. We were extremely surprised to say the least. And now this turned into an unexpected cave exploring adventure. We were all excited about the idea of exploring the cave. We walked in a good distance and noticed that this cave had a few caverns and large dark openings towards the top. Some areas appeared to go straight to the top of the canyon, probably a good 200 plus feet. It was very impressive and yet felt strangely eerie. I told my nephews to record the experience. I also mentioned that it would be neat to capture any footage of a desert fox or maybe a bobcat in there. I just told them to be very cautious as we explored. My 20-year-old nephew continued ahead at a certain point as the rest of us took a minute to record our surroundings. We were at a point in the cave where it was necessary to climb about 4 feet to continue forward. This was the spot my nephew continued alone. A few moments later, my nephew was saying something. We couldn't really hear him, he sounded muffled, so we yelled for him to walk toward us. When he got closer, we heard him say, "Uncle, there is someone in here." There was a slight pause, then he said, "or something." I asked him, "What do you mean?" I continued to ask, "Did you see a fox, a coyote, what?" By now my nephew had walked back to the group. He looked visibly shaken up and very scared. He answered and said, "No, Uncle, I know what those animals look like. This was what I thought for a second was a person, but no, it was definitely not a person." He continued, "It was a strange creature like a human on 2 feet while slightly crouched looking straight at me." He then nervously and frightenedly said, "Uncle, I don't know what I just saw. What the F was that?" I tried calming him down as best I could, then he said, "Let's get out of here, Uncle. We shouldn't stay in here." Believe me, I had a strong desire to go after whatever my nephew saw, but my gut feeling was even stronger, and it said nope, not today. Recalling the missing 411 stories of people who have gone missing once they separate, I was wise to listen to my gut instinct of danger, so we quickly got out. My nephew seriously appeared as if he was going to have a panic attack. I kept calming him down. When he finally managed to compose himself, he gave me a description of what he saw. He stated that it was probably 6 or 7 feet tall and that it was either a grayish or tanned color. He said he couldn't tell if it was skin or hair all over its body, and the strangest part was that the lower part of its face was red in color. He continued to explain that there was a bend in the cave and that when he maneuvered around it, the creature was there. Its back was up against the cave wall and it was in a crouching position. As soon as his light hit it, it ran deeper into the cave darkness. My nephew said he even heard its feet hitting the ground as it ran. For whatever reason, my nephew had shut his phone off, so he didn't capture the bipedal creature he saw on video. My thought on this encounter is that perhaps this cryptid was going to attack my nephew thinking he was alone. And it is very possible that at the last second, it either heard the rest of us or picked up our scent. Realizing my nephew wasn't alone, it fled. I do believe this encounter would have been very different had my nephew been alone. As for the red lower part of its face, that's a very unusual color for a creature to have. So maybe its mouth was opened, exposing the red interior of its mouth, or it was eating something and what my nephew saw was a blood-soaked face. Fast forward to March of this year. We have continued to explore the aforementioned cave. Well, all of us except my nephew that had the encounter. He has never gone back. We have gone pretty far in the cave and have yet to hit the end. We have no idea how deep this cave is. In all these years we have explored this cave, we have yet to see whatever my nephew saw that day in February of 2019. We have, however, heard strange low deep growls, and on an occasion while exploring at night, my friend and his teen son saw a large silhouette trying to exit the cave through that opening. As soon as my friend's bright flashlight shone into the opening, whatever this thing was, it quickly retreated back inside the cave. The night I just mentioned has been the only time we have explored at night. This thing was not happy to have us in there, especially not at night. After spending a few minutes inside the cave, it started growling and making strange sighing noises. I know this sounds crazy, but the growling sounds so powerful, deep, and disturbing it reminds me of certain movies I've seen with dragons. That low, powerful rumbling growl they use is exactly what came to mind. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a dragon, I'm simply giving you an idea of what it sounds like. I've looked up dozens of animal noises to compare it with, and once again the closest thing would be a low dragon-like powerful growl. I purchased a trail cam and decided to leave it out there. We were beyond curious to see what it would capture coming out of that cave, and capture it did. The night I left the trail cam, it took several pictures. These are the pictures I will include. I have shown these pictures to friends, family, co-workers, and they agree that there is definitely a strange creature's face captured in one of the pictures. And though it is partially blocked by what is perhaps a claw or hand, it is very noticeable. People that have seen it say it looks reptilian or dragon-like. I wonder if I've possibly captured a desert reptilian type creature, such as one in encounters I've listened to that people have had in Arizona and parts of California. I agree that it does look very reptilian. I will do my best to explain the pictures you are about to see. Please let me know what you think and if you have heard of such things. As far as I know, this is the only picture of such a creature. I have yet to find one on Google or YouTube. That is the end of his first email, but not even close to the end of his story. I will put the pictures up at the end of the video. The next email I will read details some more information that pertains to his story and his investigation of the area. It reads as follows. I returned a week or so after and left my trail cam in the same area for 3 days. Unfortunately, nothing was caught on video or picture mode. This doesn't surprise me, because it is a common belief that these cryptids are extremely good at avoiding cameras. I'm happy I was able to capture the pictures I shared with you. And just to clarify, we were never on a monster quest. Don't get me wrong, I do believe there are different types of cryptids that share this world with us. But like I mentioned before, we were just enjoying the outdoors and exploring nature. It just so happened that we were meant to find this particular cave, and the creature or creatures decided to make their presence known. So me, being of a curious nature, won't miss the opportunity to investigate and get as much information as I can regarding this type of enigma. I am also very careful and intelligent on my approach. I've learned to trust my gut instincts and will leave immediately if I sense danger. I really believe my patience and careful determination has paid off by yielding me these thought-provoking and interesting pictures. The only regret I have that day I left my trail cam. In my haste, I didn't activate video mode as well. But lesson learned. I will continue to monitor this cave and canyon, and I am confident I will eventually capture videos of these things. My theory is that this cave, as you mentioned, might very possibly be connected to an even larger cave system, making it the perfect place for many of these creatures to hide and live in. Also, if you would like to share my encounter and pictures with your subscribers, I believe we have the right to know about these things. My hope is that perhaps more people can come forward with similar encounters and perhaps even pictures or videos. After all, the forests are not the only place strangeness happens. That is the end of his second email. Jay also told me that his nephew suffered from extreme hair loss after his encounter. He lost all the hair on top of his head, his eyebrows, and his facial hair. When he saw a doctor, he was told it was COVID related. However, tests could not conclusively prove this. Jay believes, as I do as well, the hair loss is due to extreme stress from his encounter. His nephew was so traumatized over what he saw that he refuses to go back to the canyon, and with good reason. I don't think any of us can blame him. The doctor did mention that the hair loss could be permanent. Jay said his nephew is doing well now though. Moving on, the next email he sent that I want to share talks about him going back to the area in February of 2021, where he found physical evidence of a creature. It reads as follows. Back in February of 2021, while we were hiking near the aforementioned cave, I noticed a terrible stench. We looked around thinking we would undoubtedly find a dead animal. After searching the area, I noticed a strange-looking patch of hair on the ground. After further examination of the patch, we could not conclude what it came from. It did, however, have a rancid stench. I placed the patch of hair in a sandwich bag and placed it inside my truck under the passenger seat. We found no signs of a possible struggle, blood, disturbed dirt, or other indicators. Later that day, as I cleaned out my truck and went to retrieve the bag, it was gone. I have no clue as to what happened to it. Keep in mind, when I placed it in my truck, I was alone. That is the end of that email. The strong smell Jay describes is something that happens a lot during cryptid encounters. He later told me regarding the stench, quote, "I will never forget that stench it had. It literally smelled like 1,000 rotting corpses." End quote. The way he describes the smell is consistent to other stories I've heard where people describe it much the same way, pungent and putrid. He went on to tell me that he found some skin along with the hair and describes it as being black and thick, and that there were 2 canine-like puncture marks in the ground. This led me to believe, based on the appearance of the hair and with the canine holes, that it could have been a dogman. Jay also got that impression and believes it could have also belonged to a Sasquatch. He believes whatever the fur belonged to was the victim of a nasty bite, but there were no other signs of a wounded creature. The next email of Jay's I want to share is the one containing the encounter his coworker told him about that involves the coworker's friend coming face to face with a creature. Also, the email starts with a comment about something I mentioned to him. He told me about the fur, and it's that there might be more than one cryptid in that area. The email reads as follows. You alluded to the possibility of different cryptids roaming the area. I completely agree. I have heard of people reporting strange footprints in the nearby deserts and canyons. I also heard of a lady that while viewing the mountains and canyons near Joshua Tree while her husband was driving down I-10, reported seeing a huge black bipedal creature walking near the top of a canyon and lost sight as it walked behind boulders. I've done my research of this area and have found no reports of strange encounters. Now I realize that doesn't mean they haven't happened, since many people rather keep silent rather than be ridiculed. And like I mentioned, we have been going to these canyons for a couple of decades now. I did, however, find the name to the place we visit on Google Earth, and the name says it all. I really doubt that these places are given random names. Whoever is in charge of naming them knows exactly what they are doing. I will not include the name in order to keep this place secret, as there are many people who might cause damage or vandalism to such a spot. I will share the only story I was told by my coworker regarding the canyons I visit. He stated the following encounter to me. My good friend took a girl on a date to the canyons to stargaze. They arrived late at night around 10 or 11 p.m. While they sat around and talked a bit, they started hearing strange noises outside the car. My friend got out and checked their surroundings. My friend said he heard strange growling and hissing noises. He was frightened and immediately left. My coworker continued saying, my friend returned a week later with his girl to the same spot. They figured it wouldn't happen again. As they sat in the car, the same noises started again. This time my friend had a spotlight and he proceeded to investigate the strange sounds. As he exited the car, he heard something moving around in the dark. His girlfriend was scared and told him to get back inside the car and leave, but his curiosity got the best of him. He continued looking for whatever was making these strange growling and hissing sounds. The dark of night and a few desert trees and shrubs made it hard to pinpoint where it was. My friend shut his light off and waited until he heard the next growl. He quickly turned his light on and pointed in the direction of the growl. He said he saw a reptilian-like bipedal creature with huge eyes, fangs, and claws growling at him. He couldn't tell if it was the light reflecting off the eyes or if they just glowed red, but at the same time he was frightened and ran back to the car and left. My coworker stated that his friend told him he will never go back to those canyons. His friend told him in Spanish, and sorry if I butcher this, "Allá está el diablo," which translated into English means, "the devil is there." Jay goes on to say, what I find interesting about this encounter is the fact that without me mentioning the location, my coworker's friend told him exactly where he drove and gave him the information. Turn by turn is the exact place, or for the sake of argument, very near where we found the cave. His friend also mentioned that the creature was between 5 and 6 feet tall. I think that it is probable that this man saw the same creature or creatures my nephew saw inside the cave and the same creature or creatures my trail cam took pictures of. That's the end of his friend's encounter. Just like Jay said, in the exact location where he and his family came across something in the cave they explored. One thing I want to point out here is that the growling from this story also lines up with what Jay said he has heard out there at night. Also, reptilian cryptids like the one described in this story are usually seen in the desert. And it's what looks to be caught on camera by the trail cam Jay put out there. So without further ado, let's take a look at the pictures he captured. The first picture is a Google Earth shot of the area showing all of the cave entrances in the proximity of where he and his family have had their encounters. I mentioned to him about the cave systems all across the US and how they would be perfect for cryptids to use to hide, as we have no idea how far down they actually go. It's kind of like the ocean in a way. Jay believes he has stumbled across one such cave system in this area. The next pictures are a picture of the cave he and his family entered where his nephew saw the creature and where he placed his trail cam. Alright, let's move on to the pictures you've all been waiting for. The first pictures I'm going to show you are of the eye glint caught in the darkness and what looks like fur in the bottom right corner of the camera. These cameras are motion activated, so for these pictures to have been taken means something was moving around in front of it. Therefore, we can't see the creature, but we do get the light's reflection off of its eyes and also what appears to be fur from something moving in front of the camera. These pictures are compelling enough, but the next ones I'm going to show are even better. Now, as you can see in this picture, the trail cam seems to have gotten a picture of the creature's face. I'll also include the picture pointing out the facial features so you can compare the two. You can clearly see the eye to the left, and this thing definitely looks like it has reptilian skin. Left of the head is what looks to be a claw. Here is what Jay had to say about this picture. The eye is very clearly visible. The strange reptilian skin is also very noticeable. What also intrigues me about its facial features is the mouth. It has thick, oversized lips. Usually, reptilian encounters state that the mouth is thin. Something else to consider since we only have a two-dimensional picture. After studying the image, I have concluded this reptilian being has a slightly protruding mouth. Also, I know it's hard to notice, but its claw appears to have spiky hair-like or quill-like appearance. Extremely strange. But I guess that's what cryptids are, very strange in appearance. Jay also saw an image on a YouTube channel he thought looked very similar to this thing's claw in the picture from his trail cam. He says what caught his attention about the claw from the picture he sent me of the dogman was how it was shaped just like the humanoid figure's hand in his trail cam picture. When zoomed in, they look a lot like each other, and it's very intriguing just how similar they really are. Now, I will say I'm not sure where the image of the dogman came from, but if I had to venture a guess, I would say it is an artist's rendition, but if it was created based on someone's sighting, then that's how they describe the hand as looking. Nonetheless, it is eerily similar to the reptilian creature's hand from Jay's picture. I also want to show you some pictures Jay found on the internet of what people have described these things looking like. If you compare the pictures, they look very similar. So, all in all, the trail cam picked up pictures of what looks like a reptilian cryptid. I will leave these pictures up until the end of the video. Obviously, being that it's so close to the camera, Jay believes because it saw the lights on the camera and was curious what it was, it is hard to tell what exactly this thing is. But I will agree that the skin does look reptilian. Also, the location definitely fits, being that reptilian creatures such as this one are normally associated with and seen in the desert. Another thing that intrigues me about this is that it looks like the cave theory many people have about these beings seems to be true, as their first encounter with the thing was in a cave and it ran off deeper into the network of caves it calls home. I have heard in a lot of stories where cryptids are seen in areas that are close to a network of caves and or old mining tunnels. As I said earlier, we have no idea how far down these networks of caves really go. It would be the perfect place for them to go to avoid being seen and the perfect place to make their home. What do you think about these pictures? What does it look like to you? A reptilian cryptid or something else? Also, I'd like to thank Jay again for allowing me to tell his story and show the pictures he captured on my channel. He is brave to put himself, his story, and these pictures out there. Make sure to give him a shout out in the comments. And please keep in mind that while I ask you for your opinion of what you see, please keep it friendly in the comments and responses to each other. Ridiculing others has no place on this channel. Hello and welcome to my channel. My fascination with cryptids began a few years ago when I was on vacation, listening to my cousin tell stories about Bigfoot and Dogman. I started listening to and reading every story I could find about every type of cryptid. This led to me starting this channel so I could read these stories I find so fascinating. In this episode, I'm going to share 5 scary crawler stories I found on the internet. If you are a hardcore believer, a skeptic with an open mind, or a non-believer, you are welcome here. I just ask that you keep it respectful in the comments. No one should be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Alright, now let's get to today's stories. I'm sorry about a bit longer post, but I really want to explain my encounter thoroughly because it is by far the scariest thing that has ever happened to me to this day. This happened around 10 years ago. I was 13 years old at the time. Me and my friends were walking home from the city. It was summer and we were on an island. Keep in mind the walk is around 30 minutes through a narrow road enough for one car to pass. The road is surrounded by hand-stacked stone walls, and behind those walls are olive tree gardens that are spread over the whole island. There is nothing around those walls except olive trees and woods beyond that. There are no lampposts or anything to shine lights, only moon and stars. It was a full moon, so it was relatively bright. On one part of the road, somewhere in the middle, there is a passage on the side, 2 higher walls, and a little path that is about 10 meters long. At the end of the path is a well. My friend suggested we go there to sit and chill for a while, like we've done many times before, so we did. When we turned onto the little path, my friend, who went first, turned on the flashlight on her phone and turned it toward the well. All of us saw the same thing peek out behind the well, and we all stood there for 2 seconds staring at it. We screamed at the top of our lungs and started running home. We ran fast as heck and didn't stop until we got home, literally shaking. Then, all of us in the same voice explained what we saw. The creature literally peeked out behind the well and looked at us. All we saw was the head. It looked like a bald, yellowish pale head. It had no normal facial features, just deep, big black eyes that looked straight at us. It was scary as F. We didn't dare walk that road again at night, even though it was a normal daily thing for us during the summer since we were kids. Even today, I still get shivers when I pass there, even if it is during the day. We often talk about that encounter when we see each other because we all saw the same thing and we are certain it wasn't a person or any normal type of animal. A few weeks ago, I found a picture online. We all agreed it looked exactly like this. It says online that it's a skinwalker/crawler. I found some info online that they tend to hang out in secluded areas such as woods, graveyards, etc., which all makes sense because we were in the middle of nowhere and the graveyard is on the beginning of the road uphill from the city. I don't know anything about crawlers. I only found out about them recently, but does anyone know what that might have been, and is it possible that it really was a crawler? What are your thoughts on it? One commenter seemed to think that it was a crawler that the OP encountered. Someone posted a podcast a couple of weeks ago on this sub, and one of the stories the host told was about a family who witnessed a crawler coming out of their well that was on their property. Weird, kind of reminded me of this because you said you saw it close to an old well. Creepy. The OP responded, "Yes, it was right behind the well, just peeking out with the top of its head. I'll never forget that scene. I've gone back to that well a lot of times since then, even alone, since I thought there must be a rational explanation for what we saw. But after reading everything and researching a bit more, I don't think I'll go back there anymore." I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you who don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 pigs or more. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that cost literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting on it was worth it. But I did it. I took it to the range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy to find spots that I could set up in that overlooked a large, easy to navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbit or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night but lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m. and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision, it's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, it was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public land. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something. Twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning on earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about to this day. He squatted and placed his hand on the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost!" There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was aimed at the dirt at his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help! Please! I can't walk!" the voice called out. That's when I called BS. Not only could he walk, but when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person, so good I mistook him for a bear. That's an effing trap. This guy is trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a crap at that moment. I took my eyes off of him for a second to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. How in the heck had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. "F off!" I screamed in that direction. He stood upright and it hit me how tall and skinny he was, easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction. I instinctively sent a round sailing over his head into the tree line. He was freaky as heck, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will F you up. Go away." He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on my last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left toward the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. The first time I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land like some kind of caveman. I reported it to the Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. I never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen the thing, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole on these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw definitely was a Wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, thought I'd share. Edit. Believe what you like. These are events as I recall them, and no, I'm not a writer. One commenter seemed to think it was something else entirely. Yeah, you encountered a crawler. They are very good at mimicry. I'm glad you gave it a warning shot as it definitely noticed you. Their senses are incredibly adept, most likely from living in caves, or it could have saw the movement of you messing with your gear. Living in caves would make them great at spotting movement in low light conditions. My guess is it found your scent, and that was either a trap to make you come to it or to hear if you were nearby. Get a mag light or an extremely bright flashlight to either blind or damage its skin. Throwaway account made by a concerned mother. We live in a small town considered semi-rural over an hour outside of Houston, Texas. My son is 14. His two best friends are 13 and 14. They are, quote, country kids who fish and explore the creeks around our neighborhood almost as much as they play video games. They are into fishing, camping, bushcraft, just really outdoorsy teens who keep out of trouble and go fishing a lot. Good, honest kids. Our neighborhood is about 150 acreage home sites, with the smallest being 1 acre and the largest being 20 acres. Lots of woods, tall pine trees, and creeks. The neighborhood is basically surrounded by wooded floodplain where nothing can be built and lots of intertwining creeks that flood in heavy rains. There are literally thousands of deer. Soil is sandy loam and height above sea level might be 600 feet, so no caves that I'm aware of. Around 2 months ago, my son came home and told me he had seen a glimpse of something in the woods. All 3 boys were at a part of a creek they had not frequented much before. My son glanced up and saw the nude, unusually light grayish skinned back of an extremely thin humanoid. It seemed to be 4 to 5 feet tall and moving away from them, slouching, moving in a weird, distinct way and on all fours with really long arms. He directed his friend's attention to it, but it was just a glimpse as it moved away from them behind some brush next to a large, thick, old tree and just seemed to be gone. They didn't hear it move off or see anything else. The reason he felt comfortable telling me this is because I had already warned him that there are things living in the woods that we should share this planet with. My great uncle, who lived to be 83, spent his entire retirement, quote, deer hunting with little more than binoculars on his property in north central Texas. He clocked literal decades sitting in tree stands in the woods, and once I was in my early 20s, he told me there were things in the woods we don't even know about, but they're there. I'm certain he had seen things and creatures. I passed the verbal knowledge and warning on to my outdoor-loving son around age 12 in hopes that it would help him stay calm and not fear nature if he ever saw anything in the woods. Today my son and 13-year-old friend were back fishing at the creek, just the 2 of them. They had been exploring in the sandy creek bottom, crouched over looking at things in the water. They got hungry, so they packed up their small gear items to head home. My son stood up while putting on his day pack and locked eyes with this gray-skinned thing that was watching them. It was peeking out from behind a tree, and as my son saw it, he said it ducked its head behind the tree impossibly fast. My husband and I were outside our house when he rode up on his bike. The creek area is accessible from one of the neighborhood cul-de-sacs. His pants were fully drenched, and he looked like he had fallen in or scrambled through the water and sandy banks pretty good. I sent him in to shower, suspecting nothing and kind of distracted by my need to begin preparing Easter dinner. Later, when it was just us, he told me what happened. The thing was watching my kid, my only child. He had told his friend that he had seen it watching them, and they immediately left the creek area. His friend clearly being able to hear the truth in the tone of my son's voice and not wanting to stick around. But yet again, he described it as being 4 to 5 feet tall, and he said it looked like it had no mouth. It was small enough that it hadn't terrified him, just kind of disturbed him. All 3 boys have told me the creek in that area feels creepy, but being teenagers, they seem to get curious again, overcome their hesitations, and go back, even though I request they fish elsewhere. Looking for some serious input here. Are these things dangerous? Update. Talked to my son tonight and made it clear he's to stay out of that area. I asked him for any additional information he could remember. He went into a little more detail that is quite frankly troubling. He described it as bald and having a kind of long neck, reiterated that it moved impossibly fast. The image seems to be burned into his mind because he said there were 3 woodpecker-like holes in the trunk of the tree it was hiding behind. He said there were some weird sounds they heard as they were down at the creek this afternoon. They heard 2 owls calling to each other in the middle of the day, which was not something he really thought about until I confirmed they were hooting multiple times back and forth midday. One was high in a tree somewhere fairly nearby, so the boys actually hooted back and mimicked crow calls, just being silly as they fished. The second owl was in front of them in the direction of where the crawler that peeked out from behind the tree was later spotted. My son said the owl hoot sounded very real, but he also noticed the woods had gone quiet very shortly before he saw the crawler. He said when they were first at the creek, there were squirrels running along tree branches and birdsong. He said the woods were quiet when he saw the thing peek out from behind the tree, but that there had been the owls hooting before that, which is how the owls came up. The man who also posted from Texas had described fake owl noises, but these owl hoots sounded very real to my son. I'm mentioning it because it could literally have been owls. It is springtime, nesting season, etc. His watch had beeped, signaling the 4 o'clock hour, maybe 10 minutes before he saw the crawler, so he had time reference for the event. The boys had heard a clicking noise a couple of times that he said did not sound like a human making a clicking noise, but more mechanical or dry, like a bug. He thought it was some kind of bug, but it was weird enough his ears picked up on it. They both heard clicking at least twice and agreed it was some species of weird annoying bug. He asked me tonight if I thought it was Morse code language crawlers may use. I have no idea, and I have never heard the clicking myself. I asked if he had felt like he was being watched. He said no, but he did have a mild gut feeling of something slightly amiss when the birds and squirrels went quiet or absent, which he halfway noticed about the time he was shouldering his pack, seconds before seeing the crawler. As a mom, the idea that 1, there could have been more than one, what with the hooting and clicking, and 2, that the things might have been making noise to get the boys' attention really bothers me. I'm not at all surprised the woods had gone quiet. My son said both eyes face forward on the crawler, which means it is a predator, not a vegetarian. I don't sleep with curtains open because of crawlers. I'm a grown woman now and I still can't sleep at night with the curtains open. In fact, when I moved into my current house, I installed dual curtain rods, so even if my light blocking curtains are open, there's a layer of privacy shears behind them to block any sight. I have seen the crawler 4 times. I truly don't know if it's the same one. They were all seen at different locations. It's been years since I last saw one, but I still feel like they were the same creature, or at least they knew me. The first time I was a very small child, perhaps 4, maybe 5. My house was an old-style flood house, so it was technically 2 stories tall, but under the house was where we kept the car and our laundry room. Upstairs was where the living areas were. We were one of the only houses there. It was in the early days of the town, and there were only a few other houses on the cul-de-sac. The back of our property was maybe 500 meters from the ocean, but you couldn't see or hear the coastline from the house. There was some light rainforest surrounding our fully fenced house. My bedroom faced the back of the property. I woke up one night, which wasn't unusual for me because I was a very light sleeper. This particular night, my parents hadn't closed my curtains. When I looked towards my window, I could see it. Keep in mind, I was on the 2nd floor. It was looking through my window. I couldn't see much. The only light was coming from outside, but I could see the silhouette of its body. It was pale and thin, but still the frame of the creature was huge, easily 2 meters tall. It was hanging off my roof, holding on to the frame of my window, and even though I couldn't see its face, I just knew it was looking at me. I was terrified. It's been almost 2 decades since I saw it, but I can still remember the intense fear I felt. It took me so much courage to get out of bed and walk to my parents' room, where I finally fell back asleep. My parents told me it was just a dream. The next time I remember seeing it, I was probably 7 or so. I had moved houses probably a few months before, and my new house, about a 16-hour drive from my old place, was a single-story home, but still on the coast. It was a lot farther from the ocean, about 5 kilometers, but very much the same kind of area. We were one of the only houses in the area, and I had no neighbors. In Australia, we have a brand that makes fences and roofs out of corrugated metal that's been painted. They're quite common, 6 feet high, cream-colored metal fences, and they make an unmistakable noise when something hits them. I have no idea how anything could climb one of those fences. They're completely smooth with nothing to grab onto. Even in my teens, I tried to sneak out by jumping the fence and I just slid right back down. At first, when I woke up, I thought some birds must have landed on the fence, but the noise continued for longer than it would take a bird to land. My next thought was that someone was trying to break into the house. I turned over in my bed to face the window and saw it. Well, I actually didn't see it at first. It was very dark out and I don't remember much of a moon. As my eyes adjusted, I could only just make out the figure hunched down in front of my window. Even in the hunched down pose, it was huge. This time I didn't run to my parents. Their bedroom was no longer across the hall. It was all the way on the opposite side of the house and I'd have to pass so many uncovered windows to get there. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I eventually woke up in the morning and again my parents told me I must have been dreaming. However, from then on they always came into my bedroom and closed my blinds before bed. The next time I saw it, I was 9. I know I was 9 because I had just moved schools and made friends with a girl we'll call Casey. She invited me to stay at her house one night and I was so excited. She was the first friend I'd made since moving schools and it had been ages since I had gotten to have a sleepover. Everything went great, the night was perfectly normal and I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Casey crying. I sat up in bed and asked her what was wrong. She pointed toward the window where I saw the thing again. Unfortunately for me, Casey had a nightlight and I could see much more of the creature than I ever had before. It looked so crusty and dry. It was almost totally white, devoid of any real identifying features, except it stared at us with black eyes and mouth agape. Casey's window was small and it had to hunch down to see us. We both got up and ran crying to her mom. She turned on the outside light and brought us back into the bedroom and pointed out a large gum tree outside the window that she tried to explain just had been what we saw. We argued with her that the thing we saw was right against the window, not several meters away, and it wasn't to the left, it was to the right. Casey's mom eventually let us sleep on the couch. A couple of months later, Casey stayed over at my house. When I woke up in the morning, Casey was gone. I asked my parents and they told me that Casey had gotten up in the night and started crying, begging to go home. When I saw her at school on Monday, she told me she had gotten up that night to go to the bathroom, and when she walked past the lounge room, she could see the tall skin monster crawling through the trees at the bottom of my backyard. She never came to my house again, and I lost touch when I moved schools a year later. I don't know what it was I saw. It can't have been sleep paralysis. I was able to move and speak and everything, and it wasn't a dream because someone else saw it. I don't know if this relates in any way, but when my significant other moved into my house a few months ago, he opened the curtains one night before bed. This time, it was a full moon. I had already fallen asleep. I'm now living in a 2-story house with my bedroom on the 2nd floor again. I woke up in the middle of the night to him getting up and closing the curtains. When I asked him why, he told me he had a nightmare that there was a tall, skinny white man clinging to my roof, almost like a spider, and it was peering into my bedroom. He said it must have been a hallucination. He had been up all night playing video games, and when he got up from bed, it jumped back onto the roof. I still haven't told him, but his description of what he saw is exactly what I saw the first time I saw the crawler. Only now I'm living in a busy neighborhood with plenty of houses, unlike past experiences where I've been one of the only houses on the block and surrounded by forests. I have heard mimicking many times, but have always drawn it up to imagination. Sometimes I will hear my significant other walk into the room and say hello at night, but when I roll over, I see the light coming down the hallway and I realize that he's in the lounge room or on the computer. I've heard my mother's voice a few times too. Throughout my childhood and all the homes I've lived in, we've had issues with dogs barking at nothing and security motion detector lights randomly coming on at night when nobody is there. I don't know if those two things are related or not, but I've heard similar happenings and crawler-related stories before and thought I'd mention it. Those are my stories. I don't know if I've seen a crawler or something else, or if I've seen anything at all, but I found this subreddit and I thought, hey, at least there are people here who have seen things similar to me. Excuse this long post, but I'm trying to give lots of detail and specifics on the experience. I was 15 years old on a muzzleloader's mule deer hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote and beautiful places in the state. I've been frequently out in this area spreading in Summit County that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming since before I can remember, including lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I am skeptical of things not proven by methods of science, but I don't deny all of those things. I find that it's impossible for science to know of all that is out there in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state. He was a regional scientist and was over wildlife and habitat management for many years. Everything from habitat management programs, controlled fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transported and darting black bears. He has seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small animals, ruminants, plants, and natural phenomena for a majority of his life, and he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to even imagine. He's scientific, honest, straightforward, level-headed. He's agnostic and is not superstitious, and often used to, loving and respectfully, tease a certain CO who thinks certain Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and other beings exist. Other than this experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not at least partially, if not completely, identify. And other than the natural, innate fear of being in close quarters with a bear, drunken and belligerent hunter, or incredibly potent tranquilizer medication, he's told me over and over he's never been terrified of an animal or experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high Uinta Mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzle loaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women my grandfather had worked with over the years as a supervisor, biologist, CO, and these were people I grew up with. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a buck, injuring it but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon upset and concerned that the deer had run into even more secluded area of the mountain which was hard to reach from the trail that she had spotted it from. A place my grandfather was familiar with because it was such a pain to get to, with lots of deadfalls and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape and he was so familiar, it didn't seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing what she assumed was coyotes, which made her even more concerned that if the deer died, they would ruin the meat and the hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early evening, expecting to be back within an hour or two after searching and having our guns with us in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was still in places with lots and lots of deadfall and varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand the other hunters' fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange pieces on the trees which we followed for maybe 20 minutes, and then it got hard to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew getting out would be just as long as getting in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been recently bedded down in, followed with spatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set and the light had faded from the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them now completely safe, as it was now illegal and irresponsible to hunt in such absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large Maglite flashlight from his pack, and I put in my headlamp to begin the hike back, using our GPS to find the trailhead. About 10 minutes on the way back, we started to hear more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as animals would likely be starting to head towards clearings for water or graze in the safety of lower light. Small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterings of hooves, animals, or small bits of movement in the trees from squirrels or birds were common and expected. We did not expect the deafening, disturbing sound we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl, but by a few seconds in, it was unidentifiable, frightening, and human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but then got louder and more intense, with a screech to it, so unlike any coyote or any animal we have ever heard. Then came the chittering between the shrieks, and the movement in the trees seemed calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious, and a little baffled at what could be making those sounds. It sounded human, but with no words, with no urge of tone of help or I'm just screaming to mess with you. We continued on after it mostly stopped, and it seemed like the other natural and distant sounds had gone almost silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horribly deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us back to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again and sounds of thumping against dead trees. Looking around with our lights, in between deadfall and maybe 12 to 15 feet in front of us was a large human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down with long slender arms around the front of a standing aspen. The aspen, of course, was pale white with the knots being dark brown, and whatever it was had skin almost as pale. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It seemed round. The eyes seemed sunken, and I could not tell you the eye color other than a flash of reflection from my light. Its face seemed sunken and emaciated. I didn't see any fur or hair. I never felt like it looked right at me, more my grandfather, and just in our direction, almost confused and curious, like he was before with the sound. For a mere couple of seconds, I caught a glimpse of it, but that was it. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut tight, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck, and my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backwards toward me. I heard the thing go off to our side, moving quickly and through the trees with purpose, to the side, and then it dropped down behind us, I would assume, according to the sound. I hoped it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it veered off, as to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I had never before and never since seen him so confused, baffled, horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice, and I asked him, "What was that?" Over and over I asked, and he had no answer for me. He took his gun off his shoulder and put the cap back on the igniter, making the gun live, and then he carried it in front of his body in his arm. He pulled out another headlight to put on himself. We started walking toward the trail again as he listed off to himself what it wasn't. Things like, couldn't have been a deer, or elk, or moose. It had arms. It was hunched. It stood upright. Or a bear? A very sick bear? It couldn't have been a bear. Was it the light? We heard this sound. The screeching human howl distantly once more before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel but fairly flat and no deadfall. We practically jogged to the truck. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed, and my grandfather turned on music as loud as possible to try to distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we got back. He went to talk to the others by the fire when he got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk. He explained something to his friends, but I don't know what was said. The next day, everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me and saying it was probably a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer the hunter shot was found the next day, scavenged quite harshly by what I assume was coyotes. To this day, he has no clue what it was, nor what that sound was. Before and since then, I've heard both coyote and many other animal sounds that never even compared to that sound. The scientist in me, and in him, the hopeful and the blissfully ignorant people in us both, hope and speculate it was just a deformed sick animal in scant light. But I still have no clue what that thing was, and I hope I never ever experience it again. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.